Continental or European philosophy is a term that we use to describe a school of thinking that has a geographical marker. Continental refers to the old continent, mainland Europe. It also has a temporal marker. It is usually referred to as a school of thought that only existed from the 20th century onwards, but it has its precursors in the 19th century. I'm going to start with an easy example. Early in the morning, before you wake up, before you even open your eyes, what do you feel? You feel the softness of a blanket against your body, you feel the softness of a pillow against your cheek, you hear certain noises, then you open your eyes, you want to wake up, you see the world is simply there, it exists, it pre-exists your waking up, you could say. This is a simple, a banal fact, but it is actually a cause for philosophical excitement. The givenness of the world, you could say, is where continental thinking starts from. I think it might be something similar, something like this, a quite banal experience that motivated the Danish 19th century philosopher Søren Kierkegaard to write a phrase that has become quite famous after Kierkegaard. I quote, "Life is not a problem to be solved, but it is a reality to be experienced." What stimulated Kierkegaard the most is the idea that a philosopher should not have the ambition to look for infallible knowledge or absolute truth, but that a philosopher should maybe be more modest, that a philosopher should set himself the task to relate to a world that is given, that pre-exists the individual and cannot be fully controlled or mastered. And this is important for continental philosophy in general, also for four of the main schools that we position within this label of European thought. I will briefly mention them: structuralism, existentialism, phenomenology, or hermeneutics. And all of these, they think that that's a banal fact, but that it is important. Now, I think this awareness of the givenness of the world marks out an important opposition with another school of thinking that is popular in faculties of philosophy today, analytic philosophy. Analytic philosophy models itself after the sciences. It models itself after the sciences in the sense that it looks for cumulative knowledge and that it looks for a transparent or a clear methodology, a very strict methodology. If we go back to one of the founding books of analytic philosophy, the book that was written by Ludwig Wittgenstein, an Austrian-British genius, a very important philosopher. He wrote it in 1921 called Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. In this important book, Wittgenstein, without blushing, says that he has solved all the fundamental philosophical questions. How did he do this? He looked for a strategy of purifying philosophical language by translating philosophical concepts and categories into the crystal clear, the transparent categories of logical argumentation and scientific thinking. In this sense, philosophy truly progresses and we can solve those fundamental issues. With continental philosophy, however, we see that there's an emphasis on the opposition between scientific thinking and philosophical thinking. We usually see even a very critical attitude towards those very ideals that were important to Wittgenstein, the very ideals to seemingly reduce truth to scientific truth, to seemingly reduce knowledge to factual knowledge. For instance, the aim of a school of thought that we call positivism or scientism, the ambition there is precisely to perform this reduction, and continental philosophy will therefore be very skeptical about those ambitions. Even in the late 18th century, with a German philosopher, a major name in the history of philosophy, Immanuel Kant, even there we encounter skepsis about these ambitions. In late 18th century, Kant already says what matters the most is to emphasize a domain of thought, a domain of thinking that is, properly speaking, philosophical, and that is to be differentiated from scientific thinking. And he says what matters the most is not to look for infallible knowledge, not to obtain truth that cannot be doubted. What matters the most is to discover, to explore the limits of human understanding. A second result in this opposition, a result of this opposition between scientific thinking and philosophical thinking, is that the position of the subject becomes important for philosophy. Subject. The subject is a different word for the human being, the individual who is engaged in the project of philosophical thinking, the person who thinks, the person who is contemplating, who is the philosopher himself. For scientists, the human being behind the research is not all that important. Subjectivism is what runs counter to objectivism, to a neutral stance. For continental philosophers, the subject is where it all starts. Individual thinking starts from individual existence, from a life, from experiences that you have. This is a source of philosophical meaning. This is not where philosophical thinking is led astray. I think a quote by the 18th century thinker Fichte might be interesting here. Let me quote for you. He says, "A philosophical system is not just a piece of household equipment that one can simply pick up, can simply put down again at one's will. No, a philosophical system," Fichte says, "is animated by the soul of the person who stands behind the system." This awareness is important for thinkers from Nietzsche onwards to Derrida onwards. These are two names, Nietzsche, end of the 19th century, Derrida, 20th century post-war thinker, and they will share this ambition to put subjectivity in a central position. They will try to bridge the gap between human existence on the one hand and philosophy on the other hand. Now, a third element is also a result of this basic opposition with science. I think it's important to state that in continental philosophy, the main questions, the most fundamental issues that have been important to philosophers from the very early stages onwards, they return, they come back, and they become central to philosophy. For instance, the universal question of subjectivity, what it is to be human, or the eternal question of mortality, what is death, is there a life after death, how do we understand mortality, or probably the first question for metaphysics, the question of being. Those huge mysteries of existence, they are important to continental philosophers. And this again is in opposition with the analytic tradition. If we go back to this book that I quoted from earlier, the early Wittgenstein and the 1921 book, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, there we see that for Wittgenstein, those mysteries, they're not all that important. He says that those philosophical problems, they might not be called falsities, but he says that they're nonsensical. Why? Because they usually use ambivalent, ambiguous language that cannot be purified in the transparent, crystal clear argumentation that we look for in scientific reasoning or in logics, the transparent, crystal clear logical system that a philosopher like Wittgenstein looks for. It's hard to find these kinds of categories in the philosophical reasoning about being, subjectivity, or mortality. For Wittgenstein, for instance, an issue, a concept like human freedom doesn't refer to something that can be pinpointed in the outside world. It's not an event, it's not a fact that can be described. We have no empirical information about what it is to be free. So maybe we could say with Wittgenstein that these concepts, they're problematical. Why should we busy ourselves? Why should we occupy ourselves with a question like what it is to be free? We are here in the university library, in the main hall of the university library in Leuven, right in the city center of Leuven. This place embodies three things that are essential to contemporary universities. We have the library building itself, which embodies scientific knowledge, scientific research. Over there we have an artwork. Art embodies creativity, experimentation. And over here today, it's Friday, we have the marketplace. This is actually where philosophy started. This is the world, this is society. These are three quintessential elements of contemporary universities. The artwork over here and the library, they embody two pillars of contemporary university and contemporary science for a different reason. The artwork was made by the Belgian artist Jan Fabre. Jan Fabre is very interested in the natural sciences, mainly in biology. And he's motivated by the melancholy that underlies those natural sciences and biology in specific. The melancholy of maybe having to pay the price of taking the life out of the object that you're researching when you look for ultimate knowledge about this object. The humanities are embodied here in this library because humanities always work with language. The positive sciences, they work with laws and with facts that can change and that are eternal. The humanities work with language. Publication of books is quintessential in the humanities. And here you can find maybe a different type of melancholy. The melancholy here is that you have to let go of the ideal of ultimate knowledge. What can be gained when you lose this ideal is precisely the idea that knowledge is infinite. It will always evolve, it will always change. It is part of history. There will always be books that are published. Continental philosophy models itself after those ideals of the humanities. Analytic philosophy models itself after the ideals of the positive sciences, of the natural sciences.